In previous videos, I've gone over several of Japan's light aircraft carriers, from the original Hosho to the final Ryuho, and things in between from Shoho to Ryujo. However, there's one class, or pair of ships to be specific, that I have yet to cover, the Chitose class. In today's video, we'll be looking at one of the two in the form of Chiyoda, the second one, and a ship with an interesting fate. She would be lost at Leyte Gulf like so many others, or more specifically, off Cape Nganyo alongside Chitose, Zuiho, and Zuikaku. Unlike the latter two, however, Chiyoda would be finished off not by airstrikes, but by surface gunfire from American cruisers and destroyers. An unnecessary move, really, but one that drove home how far Japan's carrier force had really fallen. However, that's for later. First, we'll look to where Chiyoda began, in a story similar to other Japanese conversions like Zuiho or Ryuho. I've touched on this before in my videos on Japanese warships. They were consistently trying to get around treaty restrictions. With the carriers in particular, this meant conversion. The Japanese built several different types of naval auxiliaries with the full intention of converting them later on. As the plan went, they would get several carriers relatively quickly by doing this. In this regard, Chitose and Chiyoda began as seaplane tenders, or as the Japanese called them, seaplane motherships. Let's briefly touch on that original design before moving on. As built, Chiyoda was a mostly flush-deck ship. After the single funnel, there was nothing aside from the cranes and catapults to operate the aircraft. While ahead of the funnel, there was only a relatively small bridge and her light defensive weaponry, consisting of 4 127mm 5-inch dual-purpose guns and 2 twin mounts, along with 12 25mm anti-aircraft guns. Not very much all told, especially for a ship that displaced 12,550 tons on a length of 631 feet, 192 meters, with a beam of 61 feet or 18 meters. On the other hand, that large empty space was taken up below deck, where Chiyoda had a large hangar capable of carrying 24 floatplanes, which is actually quite a large air wing for any seaplane tender, no matter the nation. A further reflection of Japan's heavy investment in the type, just like the Tones. They put a lot of time and effort into perfecting floatplane scouts, since the proper carriers were intended for strike missions and not scouting. In any case, to round this bit off, we have the speed, a relatively fast 29 or so knots on 56,800 shaft horsepower, through 2 shafts, though this was split between 4 boilers producing 44,000 shaft horsepower, and 2 diesel engines supplying 12,800. With this rounding off the design, at least the initial one, we can now turn to service history. Unlike many of these conversions, the Chitoses would actually see a fair bit of service in their initial design. Probably because, again, the Japanese put a lot of effort into seaplane tenders. As such, the majority of this video will focus on that initial tender service. This would see Chiyoda laid down on December 14th, 1936 in Kure. She would then be launched on November 19th, 1937, and commissioned on December 15th, 1938. Almost exactly 2 years down to the day. That said, the ship wouldn't properly enter service until 1939. She would be in sea trials and working up until after the new year. For many Japanese ships, her story would then shift to some variation of training duty. While Japan was at war with China, there wasn't exactly much for the Navy to do, other than patrol or support duty. Chiyoda would be an exception. She was paired up with a fellow tender, Kamoy, and sent off to China. Her float planes would then be put to use on patrol and scouting work, likely including the odd bombing mission as well. In this, she would prove useful and take some pressure off of the proper carriers, at least for a time. Chiyoda would remain off China for about a year, leaving the area in May 1940. Not necessarily because she wasn't needed, but because the Japanese had a large refit in mind. When Chiyoda returned to Japan on May 23rd, she entered dock at Kure, where the ship would be heavily modified to carry 12 midget submarines. Those were placed in pairs in the existing hangar. As a result, the air group was cut in half to 12 aircraft. When this work was done on June 23, 1940, Chiyoda returned to service, though she remained in Japanese home waters at least for the moment. The ship would be present for one of the final Great Fleet Reviews on October 11, 1940. 98 Japanese warships would be present, including both of the Chitoses. Once this was done, Chiyoda would be assigned directly to the combined fleet, where her aircraft and submarines could be of the most use, though, at least at first, not in anything resembling combat duty. Chiyoda would instead spend late 1940 through early 1941 on training duty. For instance, in November 1940, she trained the crews of Type A midget submarines, the same kind used at Pearl Harbor, with training continuing through March 1941, at which point a second group joined up in April for yet more training. At least this time, Chiyoda had assistance from a new submarine tender, Nishin. As this work continued along, Chiyoda would go into dock again in June 1941, where the tender's stern was modified with doors and slides to launch the subs. A sensible modification, really, with how much she was operating those boats. Either way, that would be done in July, with Chiyoda continuing her training work through the end of September 1941, with one particular exercise of note. In late September, she would put the submarines to use in night exercise, in particular practicing the penetration of defended harbors, notably Pearl Harbor. When that attack went through on December 7th, 1941, I suspect that some of Chiyoda's trainees were involved. I don't have the records to say that with 100% certainty. Regardless, Chiyoda herself was in Kure on December 8th, and she remained in Japanese waters on further training work through May 1942, with a short break in truck from April 24th through May 20th of 1942, after which she was assigned to the main force for the Battle of Midway. Much like Hosho, which Chiyoda was sailing with, this wouldn't mean much in the way of combat. The tender hung back with the battleships during the actual battle. Chiyoda's role was different from the carriers. She was going to set up a submarine base at Cure Island. I believe that's how it's pronounced, near Midway. However, with the destruction of Nagumo's carriers, the plan changed. Chiyoda returned home without ever dispatching her boats. Instead, she would spend late June in refit before being assigned to the Aleutians. Chiyoda carried some submarines and 6 Nakajima roof floatplanes to Kiska, along with construction workers. The tender arrived on July 5, 1942, where she would be bombed by American aircraft for no damage, after which it was back to Japan until September. Chiyoda continued her training duty for the most part, until she would be reassigned to an active theater of the war, specifically on September 15th when she was sent off to Truk. Chiyoda had been assigned to support operations in the Solomons. This did mean going to Truk first to prepare, during which on September 30th she was spotted by the submarine USS Wahoo. Fortunately for the Japanese, the sub wasn't able to get a good firing angle. As such, Chiyoda would arrive at the Shortland Islands on October 14, 1942, to deliver 8 submarines. She would remain there through 3 bombing raids, on the 18th, the 29th, and the 31st of October 1942, none of which would do any damage. Chiyoda's luck would continue to hold out in this regard when she returned to Truk on November 6th. Another submarine, USS Grayling, fired 3 torpedoes, but none would hit. I know, surprising for 1942. Joking aside, this voyage would also be Chiyoda's last as a seaplane tender. The ship was sent back to Japan, where she began her conversion to a light carrier on January 16, 1943. This would prove to be a relatively speedy affair due to what I mentioned earlier, Chiyoda being designed from the ground up for a future conversion, allowing the Japanese to get her through the rebuild in less than a year. Chiyoda's work concluded on December 21, 1943, resulting in a ship that now displaced 13,647 tons. This marginal increase came from the flight deck built up over the former main deck. Not quite a full-length deck, though at 180 meters, 591 feet long, and 23 meters, 75 feet wide, fitted with 2 elevators to support around 30 aircraft, carried in a new and larger hangar. The rest of the ship remained much the same, still around 29 knots with the same power plant as before, although she did carry more weaponry. 8 12.7 centimeter 5-inch guns and up to 48 25mm morale boosters. However, that just about wraps up the changes. Chiyoda was one of the simpler rebuilds as these things go, so let's return to her service. Unfortunately for the Japanese, as you could probably guess, there's not much to note here. Chiyoda would return to service at the end of January 1944, by which point the Japanese were firmly on the back foot. As such, Chiyoda would spend the early part of 1944 on second-line duty. She sailed to Truk in February, but would depart on February 10th, just narrowly avoiding Operation Hailstone as a result. Fortunate for her, really, considering what that did to the ships that didn't escape. In any event, Chiyoda was back in Japan on February 15, 1944, though only for a few days, with the ship assigned as an aircraft transport on March 1st. She would join the similar conversion Ryuho in sailing for Saipan, where the ships arrived on March 5th. Once that initial voyage was done, Chiyoda spent the rest of March bouncing between Japanese bases, from Borneo to the Palau Islands, before returning to Japan on April 10th to once more begin training duty. This time in preparation for the defense of the Marianas. During this training, she would be attacked by the submarine USS Puffer on May 22, 1944. Both Chitose and Chiyoda had to dodge torpedoes, although none would hit. After that close call, the ships returned to port before sailing on June 15th in response to the invasion of Saipan. Chiyoda joined up with the rest of the mobile fleet to support the bigger carriers, in what became the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. Though Chiyoda launched aircraft on June 18th, only for those to be recalled before the attack went through. At any rate, on the 19th, Chiyoda sailed with her sister Chitose and the older conversion Suiho. All three would have their air groups gutted in the Marianas turkey shoot, while Chiyoda would have the further bad luck to be hit by a bomb on June 20th. That killed 20 of the crew, wounded 30, and destroyed 2 aircraft. Now that damage wouldn't sink Chiyoda, but it did require repair, from July 1st through July 9th, 1944. With the carrier remaining in Japanese waters for some time after this. In fact, she wouldn't leave until October of 1944. Unfortunate that, because Chiyoda left on October 20th, not as a proper combat unit, but as part of the decoy Northern Force. Most of Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, though between them, they only carried around 100 aircraft. The ships were bait to draw away Halsey and the American fleet, which admittedly they did. On October 25th, 1944, the battle off Cape Engano began. Chiyoda would suffer terribly in this, though exactly what happened to her isn't clear and based entirely on reports from other ships or aircraft. What is clear is that Chiyoda was attacked around 8:24 a.m. on the 25th of October, 1944. Most of the first wave of attackers went for Chitose, crippling the ship. Chiyoda evaded damage, largely thanks to accurate fire from her escort. Chiyoda would be ordered to leave her crippled sister behind at 9:25. Unfortunately, this would not save her. 2 of her escorts, Shimotsuki and Izuzu, remained behind to pick up Chitose survivors. Chiyoda, meanwhile, would join up with Hyuga, where she would be attacked again at 10 a.m. A single bomb hit the flight deck, with several near misses buckling her plates. Chiyoda would go dead in the water by 11:15. Her escorts would attempt to protect the ship, but this failed, as did an attempt by Hyuga to take her in tow. Izuzu made a similar attempt, but this was called off at 12:25. Instead, an order went out to scuttle Chiyoda and rescue the crew. This would not happen. By 1:50, Chiyoda was under attack by American cruisers and destroyers who had closed in for the kill. They would sink the battered carrier by 3 p.m. with no survivors. Combined Fleet notes that men did go into the water, but orders went out specifically forbidding rescue operations. As a result, the entire crew, likely 971 men, went down with the ship. A sad end to a proud warship. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.